Stick around to find out how you can practice your ear training with today's sponsor, ToneGym. A few weeks ago, I made a couple of videos where I was training you on how to recognise chords by ear, which is an incredibly valuable skill. And when I was writing that video, I was coming up with songs that could be good examples of particular chords in context. And maybe it's because I'm a massive Beatles fan, but I just kept coming up with Beatles examples. It's like the Beatles seem to have an example of every chord you might want. So I thought, let's make a dedicated video to ear training, recognising chords, but based off Beatles songs. So what we'll be doing here is looking through each chord of the key, like the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 5 chord, the 6 chord, etc., giving examples from famous Beatles songs that you can use to help you identify those chords when you hear them in other songs, even in songs that aren't by the Beatles. So let's begin with chord 1 of the key, the tonic chord. So if we were in the key of C, for example, the tonic chord is C. And the distinctive characteristic, the sound of the tonic chord, is being completely at rest, completely resolved. So if I go for a little chord progression here, hear how complete it sounds. There's nowhere else I could go that would sound any more finished than the 1 chord. So that's the sound you're looking for with the 1 chord, is complete resolution. And it's very typical to end a song on the 1 chord, so that's what you can sort of imagine. Of course, Let It Be here is a great example of a song ending on a 1 chord and sounding very done. So that was the 1 chord. Now let's look at the 5 chord. The distinctive feature of the 5 chord is that it wants to resolve back to the 1 chord. So imagine that we were in the key of G flat, for example. This is the 1 chord, G flat, and the 5 chord is D flat. And we're on that D flat, particularly if there's a 7 involved, we really want to go back to the 1. That's where it resolves. So the characteristic of the 5 chord is that it really wants to resolve back to the 1 chord, which is what happens in Yellow Submarine. What do we want to happen now? Another Paul McCartney song that does that in a similar vein is the song All Together Now, which was on the Yellow Submarine film at the end. So this song is also based on a move from 1 to 5. And it's even getting the 7 in there on the 5, which makes the pull of the 5 back to 1 even stronger.
1, 2, 3, 4, can I have a little more?
The next chord we're looking at is the 4th chord of the key. So if we were in the key of G, that's the 1 chord. The 4th chord is the chord built on the 4th note of the scale, which is C. Now the 4th chord of the key is like a diluted version of the 5th chord of the key. Remember, the 5th chord of the key really wanted to go back home. Well, the 4th chord of the key wants to go back home, but it's not in so much of a rush. Now, a good example from the Beatles catalogue is the song Love Me Do, where the verse is based on the move from G to C, which are 1 to 4. So next we're looking at the 2 chord of the key, the 2nd chord of the key. So if we were in the key of E, for example, the 2nd chord of the key would be based on F sharp, because F sharp is the 2nd note of the E major scale. So we'd have the chord F sharp minor. The 2nd chord of the key is always minor by default, because that's just the chord we get when we harmonise the notes of the major scale up from the 2nd degree. And the Beatles song I'm going to give you, well, you might have guessed it from the Rhodes sound, it is Don't Let Me Down, which starts on the tonic chord of E and then goes up to the 2 chord of F sharp minor.
Don't let me down.
So for the next chord, we're looking at this one, that chord, D minor in the context of A major. What is that? That is the minor version of the 4 chord. So usually in the key of A major, the 4th note would be D major, the 4th chord's D major. But quite a common change to make in the major key is to swap out the major 4 chord for the minor version of that chord, D minor. So of course what I have here is In My Life, which is a great example of the minor 4 chord because we go initially to the major 4 chord, so that's D major, and then it goes to the minor 4. So we suddenly get that moment of the sun going behind the cloud. And then we go back to 1.
All my life, though some have changed.
So next we're going to look at the 6th chord of the key. Now, so if we're in the key of C, for example, the 6th chord of the key, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is A minor. Now the characteristic of the 6th chord of the key is that it offers an alternative place to rest. So usually we resolve to the 1 chord, but on the 6th chord, we do still feel a sense of weight and resolution, and we can just sort of sit here if we want to. You can imagine the song could end here, albeit with a sort of dark edge, because it's a minor conclusion. Now, a good Beatles song to hear this in is a song that actually uses a very famous chord progression known as the doo-wop changes, or the 50s changes. A chord progression that goes 1, 6, and then it goes 4, 5. So that is from the end of Happiness is a Warm Gun by the Beatles. We're going around that classic 50s chord change, going from 1, C, to 6, A minor.
Ultimately, the only way you get better at using your ear to recognise things about music is to practice. And a great way to practice ear training is with today's sponsor, ToneGym. ToneGym offers a whole range of ear training games to improve your listening skills. For example, their game Route 6 plays you a short chord progression and you have to identify what those chords are by ear. Or you could play their game Chordless, which instead focuses on chord type, so you have to identify whether the chord is major or minor or diminished, etc. You can also practice other aspects of music, for example intervals. With their Departures game, you're played a melodic interval like a perfect fifth or a major sixth, and you have to identify what it is by ear. Use the link in the description to start improving your ear today with ToneGym.
So the next chord we're looking at is the 3rd chord of the key. So if we were in the key of A major, for example, like we are in the song Help, the chord C sharp minor would be the 3rd chord of the key. A chord that is minor by default in the major scale, built on the 3rd degree of the scale. Now this chord has a sort of in-between quality. It doesn't necessarily sound at rest, but it also doesn't sound necessarily that tense. So the 3rd chord of the key, what's sometimes referred to as the mediant chord, is sort of a halfway house between tension and resolution. And of course, Help by the Beatles is a great example of it.
When I was younger, so much younger than today.
So the next chord we're looking at is the flat 6 chord, the chord built on the 6th degree of the scale but flattened. So in the key of E major like this, usually we'd have C sharp as the 6th degree of the scale, but here we're flattening that down to C natural. So it's a major chord built on the flat 6th degree of the scale, and a really good example of that is the song It Won't Be Long by the Beatles, where the verse is built from a change from E major and then to C major, E.
Every night when everybody has.
And another chord that doesn't belong in the key, another sort of chromatic chord, is that one. E flat in the key of F. I'm sure you can guess which song I'm playing here. So in Hey Jude, we are going from the chord F, which is the 1 chord, to the flat 7 chord. Do you recognise that? That is Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles, one of the middle sections. It's kind of hard to pin down the structure of that song, but in the middle we have this move from the chord E, which is our 1 chord, and then we go to this chord, G major. And then it goes to the 4 chord A. So what is G in the context of E? So we're in E, that's the key, and then we go to G. Well, that is the flat 3 chord, the lowered 3. So now we are looking at the major variation of the 2 chord. So you remember earlier when we were talking about Don't Let Me Down, we were talking about how the 2 chord is usually minor by default, but we could make it major, and it changes the sound of the music. So here in the song 8 Days a Week, we're in the key of D. So typically in D you'd have E minor as the 2nd chord. But in 8 Days a Week instead, we get E major. And it really gives it a really bright, colourful sound, I think. Instead of the minor having the major, it just adds an undeniable sunshine to the music. So far we've only been talking about chords in the context of the major key. But the thing is, chords can have a slightly different quality, a slightly different sound in the context of the minor key. So now let's look at some examples of these chords in the minor key. And that one I was just playing, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, is a good example of the 1 chord in the minor key. The song's in the key of A minor and starts on a nice big solid A minor chord. So just like in the major key, the 1 chord has the same quality of sounding fully at rest and resolved. It's not like there's anywhere else we could go that would sound more finished and complete than that. But unlike in the major key, we get this slightly darker edge, solemn, serious tone of the minor chord rather than the major chord. The brightness of the major chord isn't there, it's minor instead. So next we're going to talk about the 6th chord of the minor key. So if we were in E minor, for example, the 6th note is C, so a C major triad is the 6th chord of E minor. Now the 6th chord in the minor key has a sense of sort of momentary brightness because we're going to a major place but within the minor key. And it also has a tendency to want to resolve back to 1, but it's not in a hurry. We can wait there for quite a while and then eventually come home. And a great example in the Beatles catalogue of this chord, of the 6th chord of the minor key, is Eleanor Rigby.
Ah, look at all the lonely people.
So throughout this video we've been talking about chord function, the degree on which the chord is built in the scale. But something I want to show you is a few examples from Beatles songs that are great at identifying chord type. So not necessarily which degree of the scale that chord is built on, but the quality of that chord. Is it major? Is it minor? Is it augmented? Or does it have a 6th on it? Or something like that. So for example, Do you recognise that chord? That is an E augmented triad. And it is the chord that opens the song Oh Darling. What happens in Oh Darling is we get this E augmented triad, which is actually on the 5th degree of the scale, and then it goes to A major, which is the 1. But you don't necessarily have to worry about the fact that it's built on the 5th. Because we just get it at the beginning of the song there in isolation, it's a really great example of the characteristic of the augmented chord, the sort of dissonant sound of it.
Oh, darling.
Okay, what about this chord? Do you recognise that? That is the opening of Fall on the Hill. And that is a 6th chord. What we have here, well, if we look at my hands, we actually have a B minor 7 over D. But that is just a different voicing of a D6 chord. So if I remove the left hand and put the B at the top, we can see we got a 6th there. Here's the usual triad, the D major triad, and we've added the 6th degree of the scale, turning it into a 6th chord.
Day after day.
So that is the end of 4 No 1, where we're getting a G sus4 resolving to G major, which is a great sort of isolated example of the sound of a sus4 chord. Not only are we hearing a nice sort of prolonged sus4 chord just kind of on its own at the end of the song, but then we're also hearing the resolution of that sus4 chord back to the regular major triad, which is the context where you will usually hear sus4 chords, because that's kind of the beautiful function of this chord, is that it has that suspended quality, which then gives us that nice bit of release when it resolves. So that is all of the Beatles ear training I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. And if you can think of other bands perhaps that could be a good basis for ear training, maybe I could do a Radiohead ear training video, let me know in the comments about that as well.